Hello and welcome to Improving Scottish Football. My name is Kieran, and today on the podcast I've got Callum McFadden, who is a journalist, and this is going to be quite a wide-ranging conversation, but obviously it's going to be a good one. So we are going to first of all spend a little bit of time in Northern Ireland, which is a country we haven't really visited on the podcast before. We're going to talk about how they've got a strategy for growth. They've got a 5-year plan, and their clubs are doing some quite interesting stuff, particularly with integrating themselves into the local community. So even though they're a smaller footballing nation, definitely a nation to pay attention to because they're doing some interesting stuff. We're also going to delve into the Republic of Ireland. We're going to look at their TV deal. They've got a centralised broadcasting platform. You can buy a season pass, and they're actively attracting investment there as well. So again, really interesting what they're doing. And then we're going to eventually come on to talk about away ticket pricing in Scottish football. And we're going to delve into the debate on away allocations. Make sure you hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. And please do leave a 5-star review. You don't even have to write anything down. Just hit those 5 stars on whatever podcast app you're using, and that would be hugely appreciated. Let's keep this going. Let's improve Scottish football. Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Callum McFadden. Callum, how are you?
I'm very well, Kieran. It's a pleasure to be asked onto the show. I'm a big fan of it, and I think you're doing a great job at highlighting Scottish football and what we can do to obviously improve the game.
Oh, thank you, Callum. Flattery will get you everywhere. Can we start out by you giving us a quick introduction to yourself and obviously, tell us about your connection to Scottish football?
So, obviously, Callum McFadden, I'm a writer for a company called World Football Index. And my connection to Scottish football is that I normally do lots of interviews as well as covering games from the press box as well for World Football Index. And I got into Scottish football obviously from a young age, having grown up here. And I used to run my own website called Football CFB, which was a website with written articles, and there was a podcast attached to that as well, where I was interviewing, again, players, managers, a lot of them with a Scottish football connection.
Nice. And I read that you have interviewed over 500 players and managers. Is that right?
Yeah, over the last sort of 5 years or so.
Okay.
There's been quite a lot. Started with Christian Nadi, formerly of Hearts, and Robbie Crawford, formerly of Morton, and Rangers, now out in the States. And it's just grown from there. So yeah, over 500 in 5 years or so. So it's been quite the whirlwind.
Nice. Any big names or any kind of favourites that you've done over the years?
I think favourites, Henrik Larsson was absolutely massive. I had 70 minutes speaking to Henrik, and it was funny. I was at an event and Tom Boyd was there, and we got chatting, and he said, you're the guy that interviewed Larsson. He said, I lived next door to him for 7 years, and I never get 70 minutes out of him, so you've done well there.
Amazing. Yeah. Oh, what a player he was. Even if you weren't a Celtic fan, I mean, what an amazing talent he was, to have playing in Scotland. How we got 7 years out of him, I don't know. I mean, you just wouldn't get that nowadays in Scottish football. We're lucky to keep people for 2 to 3 years, really, the top talents, which kind of is probably a bit of a sign as to kind of where Scottish football is now compared to where it was, 20 years ago when Henrik was here. Cool. So your interviews have kind of taken you all over the place. Because you don't just stay in Scotland, right? You do a bit of traveling and you go and see football in some other countries. So where do you typically end up doing a lot of your work?
Well, I've covered games in England, covered games recently in Germany, last year in the Netherlands, and this year for the first time I have covered domestic league matches in Northern Ireland and also Irish Cup matches also in Northern Ireland. I covered both Irish Cup semi-finals recently, which was absolutely fantastic because the top 4 teams in the Northern Irish Premiership were the teams in the semi-finals. So it was absolutely fantastic to experience those.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about Northern Ireland. I know that Linfield are probably the biggest club. Is that fair? They've won the most titles. And I know that the current champions are Larne, which I looked up, and they're from like basically a tiny town, right?
Yeah, so obviously Linfield are the team that many people will recognise because they've won so many league titles in Northern Irish football, 56 to be precise. And, they're a team that obviously, as I say, have won and dominated Northern Irish football for many decades. However, Larne, the current champions, are a team that have been on the rise in the last 5 or 6 years in particular. The businessman Kenny Bruce, who owned and founded Purple Bricks, he was originally from Larne, and he decided that when the club was in financial difficulty that he would get involved and initially invest in the club to keep it going. And then once he thought more about it, he decided, something, I would like to actually take over the club, be totally invested, not only in the club in the local area as well. And he's been in there, as I say, for 5 or 6 years, kept the same manager the whole way through from then when they were in the Championship, Tiernan Lynch. And just last season, they won the Irish Premiership title for the first time in their history. And from where they were before Kenny Bruce came in, they were in the Championship. They were potentially going to go bankrupt. The stadium was derelict and in a real state, whereas now they've got one of the best stadiums in the country, arguably the best training facility in the country. And obviously, as I say, they've just won the league title last year. So it's a league that is on the up. The organiser, the Northern Irish Football League, NIFL, are doing lots of great work to promote the game in Northern Ireland and grow it. And they've certainly made a big impact in recent years by doing that, with attendances being up, interest in the league from broadcasters being up. And I just think the overall quality of the league is improving. Linfield came close to qualifying for the Conference League a couple of seasons ago and just missed out in the playoff round. Larne have also won a few ties in European football in recent seasons. None of them have been quite able to get into that Conference League group stage mix at the moment, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me if one of the clubs from the division does that in the next couple of years.
Okay. Are both those teams full-time or part-time? What's the kind of full-time, part-time split in Northern Ireland?
So in Northern Ireland, Larne and Linfield are both full-time, and then Cliftonville, Glentoran, Coleraine and others are part-time. Some of them moving towards a hybrid model. Glentoran are more of a hybrid, Cliftonville as well, whereas Coleraine at the moment still part-time, of course, managed by Oran Kearney, who was at St Mirren for a season. And as I say, the aim, NIFL put out a 5-year plan. The chief executive, Gerard Lawler, wants every club within the league to aspire to be full-time in the next decade or so. Now, he's honest and open about that being a bold, call, and obviously there's a strategy in place to grow the league over the next 5 to 10 years, but that's the aim. They want to continue to professionalise the league and see more teams going full-time to hopefully enhance the product.
Wow, okay. A 5-year plan, a strategy to grow the league. What a revolutionary idea. To anyone who's listened to my recent podcast, this has been a huge theme. Just how we've just been devoid of any kind of notable strategy in terms of like where we're going, with Scottish football. What is the actual growth plan? How are we improving things? There's absolutely nothing. So, okay. Good to know that at least Northern Ireland have got their some ideas in place and that they're publicising it as well.
Just on that as well, Kieran. So the 5-year plan published by NIFL is called A Bold and Brighter Future for Professional Football, and it's the NIFL Strategy 2023 to 2028. And all of the member clubs in the top 3 divisions, so the Premiership, the Championship and the Premier Intermediate League, all signed up to it, and they're all represented as part of it. And as I say, there is an aim to talk about how they're going to grow the game through their key pillars of obviously improving the competition, making sure that the governance of the game is transparent and open, that they want to grow revenues, but also fan engagement. And it's really it was seen at the time when it was released last year as quite a bold move. It's remarkable, as you say, to see a league willing to put out a vision and say, look, this is what we ideally want to achieve going forward. Whereas here, we've never had that sort of clarity and direction.
Yeah, 100%. I'm looking at it just now. Really easy to find and just a lovely presented kind of PDF that lays it all out. Fascinating. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So they're obviously keen to kind of grow the league. They have got Sky Sports as a broadcaster, and they've got BBC. Is that right?
Yes, so they've got BBC Northern Ireland as a broadcaster, but also BBC iPlayer in the sense that obviously the BBC One and BBC Two Northern Ireland will show some of the bigger crunch matches from the league. I'm thinking of the Linfield-Glentoran rivalry, or Larne versus Linfield, or Cliftonville Crusaders. Another big rivalry over there, and they will cover those games maybe on the BBC One and Two Northern Ireland channels. However, every single week there is always a game live on BBC iPlayer, and obviously anyone can access that from within the UK. And it's great that they put it on there because they're making sure that there's regular coverage of the league. And one of the things that I'm sure we'll come to is a frustration of mine in Scottish football is covering maybe the top half of the league is something that we do all the time here, and maybe don't necessarily put a spotlight on the bottom half of the league, especially at this time of the season where you're coming towards the end of a season and there's lots of drama going on, whereas they do cover all aspects of the Premiership, which I think is really important, because if you want to engage fans in your product, you have to cover it from all angles and all different lenses and make sure everyone feels included. And I think that's something that they do very well too.
Yeah. And you were also telling me that they kind of do a bit of a spin on the traditional media as well. Do you mind kind of telling us what they do?
Yeah, so the league as a whole produces takes short highlights packages of games from the BBC. Now, one of the things I would say is they don't have commentary attached to those. It's just something I think longer term they should look at. But the one thing that they do very well is they produce a feature every single week called Niffle Uncut, and this is produced by the league itself through a guy called David Kerr, who's doing incredible work at highlighting the game and the stories from clubs within. And what they do is they obviously to a match and they cover it from unique angles of fans, players arriving, the warm-ups, the action of the game itself, the passion, as I say, from the terraces, sometimes maybe even highlighting the broadcasters that are there covering the game, and they put it into a package normally between, I would say, 4 and 6 minutes. The one that was on quite recently between Linfield and Glentoran was only about 2 minutes because it was an 0-0 game, not a lot going on. But they normally produce these packages that are around 4 to 6 minutes long, and they are fantastic. Great insight into a real match day experience. And the other thing that they do as well, they've started is producing documentaries on clubs within the pyramid. They had a documentary on Lisburn Distillery last year, and then they had a documentary recently on Cliftonville as well, telling the story of the history of the clubs, the highs of the club, the lows of the club, featuring current players, past managers, fans, journalists, and everyone was really in the documentary as one, trying to tell the unique story of those football clubs. And I thought it was very powerful because, particularly with Lisburn Distillery, I knew a little about them, but not an awful lot. I'll be the first to admit that myself. And I watched that documentary, and after it thought, wow, I've learned so much there. But it's also been put together in a way that it was an enjoyable watch. It wasn't just a history lesson where you were getting hit with facts and figures left, right, and centre. There was a real story and a powerful narrative attached to it as well.
Nice. Yeah, I've mentioned before, but the Australia, they do their, all access on the A League, which is, a series, they do one a week for the entire season. They're 25-minute episodes, and they stream on Paramount Plus in Australia, but then go on YouTube. And they are just fantastic documentaries behind the scenes. And they're also worth checking out from a Scottish football perspective, because a lot of them have got, Monty, the Hibs coach, in them from last season. He was obviously in Australia, and there's an episode with Jason Cummings in it as well, which is well worth checking out. But totally, I love that sort of stuff, and it's a great way of building the audience and pulling more people into the league that might not necessarily be initially interested. So they're doing that kind of spin on traditional media. They're trying to grow their audience. The other thing you were mentioning before we recorded was about kind of how, well, Larne in particular are encouraging a better fan experience. Can you kind of talk about what they are up to, in the community and how they're trying to bring more people into the club?
Yeah, of course. What Larne are doing is they have a motto for the town, and they want to make it clear to everyone that their club is focused on the success, obviously, that they hope to achieve on the park, but they also want to create a more meaningful experience off the park where fans feel fully integrated and fully a part of what they're doing there. And what they've done in recent times is they have renovated the stadium. That's something that when Kenny Bruce came in, the stadium wasn't in great shape. It was in dire shape, in all honesty. And they've redeveloped the main stand. They're redeveloping a new hospitality area that's going to become a fans bar behind the goal. But they've also revamped the supporters club at the ground. They've made it such a nice environment that, if you were going to a match at Larne, you would want to go there before the game and spend a couple of hours before the game even starts. It's decorated very well with lots of memorabilia and mementos on the walls. And as I say, the alcohol and the other beverages that are served are reasonably priced as well. It's not as if they've got a massive markup that would make you think I'm better going to a pub down the road. They're targeting their fans with reasonable prices and a good atmosphere to get them in the mood for games. Live music on before and after the game for young kids going to the game. There's different competitions. There's been freestylers that have been there outside the ground, showing kids some of the skills they can do, getting them to practice them. Penalty shootouts, all the things that face painting, all the things that kind of younger generations of kids that are maybe just making their first steps into football, going with a parent or a grandparent or someone else in the family or friends, can get into the game. So they're really making an effort to target all demographics. And in terms of that motto for the town, they're doing a lot of work within schools. They're not targeting a specific demographic of people. They are going into integrated schools. They're going into religious dominated schools. They're making an effort to target every single aspect of the community. But I think they're also gathering great plaudits out with the local community. As I say, they've built a training facility, the Larne Academy of Excellence, and it's, I've visited the facility myself, and they've got 50 scholars who are in full time. They get their education mixed in with a football programme. 25 in the morning go into the classroom while 25 are on the training pitch. Then that swaps for the afternoon. So, they've thought about helping produce the next generation of footballers in that local area by recruiting players also all over the country, but not just thinking about the football side, trying to give them a quality education at the same time. And as I say, they are one of only two full-time teams in the league. And people listening might think, Scottish football is far ahead of Northern Irish football in terms of finance and resource, which it is. But I still think you can learn from leagues that maybe even don't have the resources that you do, because you have to be as innovative as possible to grow the game. And I think that's what Larne and football in Northern Ireland in particular has done really well over the last 5 years or so.
Yeah. Sometimes our arrogance absolutely kills me. Where sometimes, people you talk to or people you hear talk about Scottish football as if we're kind of like God's gift to football, or, and that complacency, or thinking that we are already so good and we don't really need to change things, that complacency is seriously going to catch us out. I mean, it already has caught us out, right? You just have to look at the last 25, 30 years or whatever. Us just thinking, oh, everything's fine. It's a bit like that meme of the dog in the burning building. Seriously, if you're not careful, like, I'm not going to say Northern Ireland are going to catch up with us, but, there's going to be other peer leagues that are going to be, embracing some new ideas, and we are just going to, get caught up and fall further and further behind. I'm just having a little look at the Larne website, and Scott Allen is playing for them.
He is, yes. He's been on loan there this season. And they've got a few Scottish players, and they've got Rowan Ferguson, who was at Motherwell and Queen of the South in the past. Joe Thompson, who started his career at Celtic, was at Dunfermline. Andy Ryan, who was at Dunfermline and Hamilton. So they've got Sean Want, of course, who was at Hamilton Accies as well. So they've got a little Scottish connection going over there as well in terms of playing stuff.
Okay. Right. I'll have to hop on the ferry and go and see a game at some point. Great. Okay. So that's Northern Ireland. Let's go a bit further south. Let's have a little chat about the Republic of Ireland, because I know that Northern Ireland is more kind of your speciality, but um, you've got a couple of things to mention about the Republic of Ireland, which I think is would be useful for us to hear.
Yeah, of course. And I think what they're doing in the Republic of Ireland really well, again, is marketing the game. You know, the League of Ireland have made a real effort to be recognised as a brand and seen as a, a league of football that people can be interested and engaged in supporting. They've moved the majority of their games to a Friday evening. Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland have the unenviable angle, just as I suppose we have in Scotland sometimes with games in English Premier League, is in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, you're competing with, you know, interest in Scottish football as well as interest in English football, you know. So for them, moving games to a Friday evening is a way of making sure that they, you know, have the local audience able to access the product should they be engaged to. Which, to be fair, with the attendance figures, it certainly looks as if that's been the case. They're improving year on year. And the other thing that they're doing really well is they have a centralised broadcasting platform. RTE and Virgin Media cover the games within the Republic of Ireland. They are the broadcasters that support the league, but there is also a centralised platform called League of Ireland TV, where you can pay €120 for a season pass, where you would have access to over 450 games from the Premier Division, from the First Division, or you can pay €7 for one game and you can stream those, which again I think is a phenomenal way to go about it. And I suppose the obvious thing to point out, of course, is they don't have the blackout because they're the TV blackout at 3 o'clock on a Saturday, because obviously they've moved to the Friday evening. But it's certainly a way that the league can generate more money, and obviously the clubs themselves, because they're getting the support from the broadcaster for maybe some of the big games that I assume would be exclusive to the broadcaster, but they've got the centralised platform there that fans can access over the course of a season, or dip in and out of certain games that they really want to see. And I suppose the obvious thing to point out whenever you speak about football in the Republic of Ireland is they obviously moved to a summer football model a number of years ago, and that's something that certainly has worked for them in the sense that both Shamrock Rovers and Dundalk have reached the group stage of European competition on multiple occasions since that model was introduced, and they have been very open and honest. The journalists that cover that league, that the first year or two was a bit, oh, this is strange, this is a bit alien, but they stuck with it. They had the patience to give it 2-3 years to embed itself, and it certainly paid off in the sense that, you know, teams are getting into group stage European competition, and they've got a centralised platform for the league as well as broadcasters supporting the product as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hate that excuse that we cart out every year when our teams get knocked out of qualification by teams they should be beating, which is like, oh, so we're still a bit rusty. It's still early on in our season. I mean, it's a pathetic excuse that we still get wheeled out every season. There is no excuse for not being prepared in Europe. Part of me, I think, would just be open just to going to a summer season just so that people could stop using that as an excuse. But it's also totally not true as well. I mean, you look at like you know, there was a couple of years ago when Bodo Glimt knocked out Celtic 5-1 on aggregate. Well, Bodo Glimt hadn't even started their season. They were in like pre-season, and Celtic were in the middle of their campaign. I think it was February. You know, and so this is an excuse that only seems to apply to Scotland. Yeah, really interesting about the kind of centralized platform for the League of Ireland. This is something that's been mentioned a few times before. For anyone who wants to listen more about that, there's a great episode I did with Alex Marr from SPFL Media Watch, probably about episode 5 or 6 in the podcast. You can scroll all the way back to that. But the current state of play in Scotland is that it's every club for themselves when it comes to pay-per-view. And so what you end up with is, you know, 30, 40 different streaming providers rather than just having everything under the one roof, which is not economical, it's not efficient, and the season pass thing, I think is absolutely fantastic. I mean, I would subscribe to that if I was, if Scotland had that. 120 euros for 450 games. I think that's fantastic. It also reminds me a little bit of the MLS season
Yeah.
pass. I forget how much that is. I think it's maybe 100. It's probably in a similar ballpark. I think because you also need a subscription to Apple TV on top of it. But I think that model is really interesting. The other thing about Ireland and about the League of Ireland that's kind of been on my radar for quite some time is their announcement about the amount that they're going to invest in the league. Are you familiar with that? They made a big announcement last summer, I think. Are you familiar
Yeah.
with that, Callum? Yeah.
Yeah, well, even just in Irish football as a whole, even in Northern Ireland, there is a real openness to investors coming in to support clubs, and you've seen that in recent months. Coleraine have just had a takeover. Kenny Bruce, of course, is in at Larne, and he's just the Vec family from America invest some money into Larne as well. American businessman Michael Smith's invested some money into Carrick Rangers, and as you say, the League of Ireland as a whole certainly are looking to press forward with greater investment because they're obviously in a situation. Stephen Kenny, of course, was probably the poster boy in many ways for the success of the League of Ireland by moving on and getting the senior Republic of Ireland national team job. And yes, you could argue in hindsight it maybe didn't work out necessarily as everyone would have hoped, but it proved that there was a belief in their league, a belief in the growth of that league, that the manager who was shining in that league at the time was deemed to be the man who could step up and become the manager of their national team. And for me, again, that's something that can only be a real positive because we've seen it with different national teams of a similar size to Scotland and sometimes even smaller, where there is an expectation of, well, we need to maybe get someone who's managed at a higher level, or we need to really look out with the box because we're not confident in the coaches that we're producing. Whereas obviously that has been proof in the pudding, his appointment, Stephen Kenny, that they had belief in the system of play and how things were progressing.
Yeah. So I'm just reading up on this infrastructure plan again. I've just pulled it up. It is, and again, this goes hand in hand with what we were just talking about with Northern Ireland, in that if Scotland just stands still and is complacent and thinks that we're absolutely fine, then seriously, countries like Ireland, literally, they will start to creep up on you, and not just from a kind of domestic point of view. You've got teams like, obviously, like you said, Dundalk and Shamrock Rovers. They've managed to get to the kind of group stages of European competitions. You've obviously got Sligo Rovers knocking out Motherwell, etc. So you've got the domestic front, which is seemingly only going to rise. But then you've also got the international scene as well. So basically what the Football Association of Ireland are doing is they plan to invest pretty much £750 million to modernise the infrastructure of Irish football over a 15-year period. So this isn't a quick fix. This is, again, like Northern Ireland, a long-term strategy. So they're going to spend about £40 million upgrading their national training centre for the national teams. They're going to spend £366 million at grassroots level. And then they're going to spend £335 million on the League of Ireland itself. So we might not see these kind of changes for kind of 15 years until this thing is kind of fully implemented. But I seriously wouldn't be surprised, if, fast forward to that period of time, the Irish national team could be, could be significantly better than the Scottish one, because at the moment, I mean, if you think about what the Scottish training, what are we doing with the national team kind of training centre in Scotland? I mean, I don't know what's going on with Oriam.
Yeah, I think you should have a performance centre for the national team, particularly for a country like yourselves. I think there is no reason why that couldn't be implemented and should have been implemented, before now. And I think given the success that Steve Clarke has had qualifying for consecutive European Championship, the first manager since Craig Brown in the 90s to do so, I think if there was ever a time to allow Steve Clarke and that group of players to leave a real legacy off the pitch as well as on it, would be to sort of get plans in motion to build a setup for the national team for generations to come. There is obviously the temptation to look down south at St George's Park in England, but I think we all agree, the money that they can invest in certain projects is maybe out with Aberdeen's. But just because that level of infrastructure is out with our means doesn't mean that it's completely out with our means and we should just forget about it. Why can't we make something and build something that works for Scotland within a budget that, suits and, fits exactly what we need? And, as you say with Oriam, the fact that you've had John Carver, the assistant manager of the national team, criticising that facility is just not a good look. Is that something that could have been done in private and something be done to address that? I'm sure probably that should have been the way it was done, but he's probably felt the need to address that publicly, potentially, towards the SFA themselves to say, look, have you thought about any upgrading facilities for the national team? Because we're producing the goods with these qualification campaigns at the moment, but we're doing it with one hand tied behind our back almost compared to some nations of comparative size elsewhere.
Yep. Was the main criticism that it was that the facility was being shared with kind of members of the public? Is that the main issue?
That was the criticism, but also the playing surface was a criticism that was aimed as well. And he said it was unsafe was one of the words that he used, which I thought was quite bold. But obviously he'll know what he means by that, I'm sure.
Yeah, because I think there's two kind of elements to this. One is obviously you want to have obviously the best training facilities so that you can get the best out of the players and cultivate the best talent. But the other thing is we genuinely do need, a high quality training center, a great environment, because we also want to attract people to play for Scotland. Now there's this whole, if you're on Scottish football Twitter, you get this whole thing of, oh, if he doesn't want to play for Scotland, then screw him. We didn't want him anyway, right? With the likes of Elliot Anderson and Hayden Hackney, who plays for Middlesbrough, those sorts of players. Oh well, we didn't want them to play for Scotland anyway. But we're in a very good moment with the national team, but we are going to need to compete for some players who are eligible for Scotland. And we're going to inevitably, maybe not right now, but at some point in the future, we're going to have to try and start tempting some players who are dual nationals, who are also eligible to play for England. We need to be able to tempt them to come and switch their allegiance to Scotland, potentially. There's some amazing talents all over the place. You just need to follow like the young team account on Twitter. But I mean, some of the boys in like the Manchester City academies and stuff, so many of them are eligible for Scotland. So it's like, how do you encourage them to come and play for Scotland? Like, we can do it, but if they have experience in George's Park in England, right, and it's like state of the art, and then they're coming to Lesser Hampden as a contrast, and it's like in a temporary tent at the side of the pitch where their running machines are and stuff like that. I'm not saying that's necessarily what it is, but it kind of looks like looks that way in the videos and the pictures. And I know that Elliot Anderson, for instance, he came up for a training camp in Scotland, right? And then he only lasted a day or two, and then he went back off down south. Nobody knows what the true story is there. Could it just be he looked at the setup and he was like, "Oh my God, what is going on here?" Could that be the reason?
Certainly could be feasible. I think, as you say, with the facilities that are on offer in England, as you say, state of the art, St George's Park, and even the training grounds that a lot of the teams in the Premier League, but not just the Premier League, there's a lot of teams in the English Championship and even down at League One level that have decent training facilities. Some of them, right enough, are a legacy of maybe being in the top flight before, but it amazes me that some of our biggest clubs don't have a bespoke training facility. Obviously Celtic, Rangers do, Aberdeen do, Hibs do, but I believe Hearts use Oriam as well. They don't have a bespoke training facility, necessarily for them that's been purpose built for them, which again I think is remarkable. I just think we're missing a trick here. As I say, what I witnessed when I was visiting that Larne Centre of Excellence was an incredible facility, but it's a facility that I think would be within the budget of a lot of clubs within the Scottish Premiership, but they don't have that kind of facility, and it just made me think, why don't they have that? I understand it's maybe cost effective to have an Astro pitch next to your stadium, change at the stadium and go over to the Astro pitch, or if you play on an artificial surface to train at the stadium. But I think, you have to sometimes see the bigger picture and see an investment in infrastructure as something that can future-proof your club, because if you're able to produce players from your academy that are good enough to not only play in your first team, but thrive within it and take you forward, you're only going to reap the benefits of that longer term. If you're only playing players from your academy as a last resort because the senior players that you've signed are injured or what have you, you're never really going to look to progress unless you've got a shared vision of, we are building for the future, we're producing for the future, and we will make sure there's a realistic pathway. And with the finances in Scotland and the lack of finance that many clubs point to, I would argue there's a golden opportunity to produce and invest in the academy infrastructure and produce your own players rather than rely on gambles from the fourth tier in England or the fifth tier in England that so many clubs seem to do at times.
Yeah, absolutely. So one other thing that you are kind of in favour of in terms of what they do quite well in Northern Ireland is the pricing of tickets. Do you mind chatting a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think in terms of pricing, it's something that I am passionate about in terms of Scottish football. I think we have to have a serious look at it, and I totally understand the scenario where clubs are in a situation where they have to be sustainable. The days of phoning up the bank and asking for a big loan to run a football club are over. At any level, that you're not going to necessarily have that anymore, just with the nature of the world we live in now. But I think we seriously have to think about the cost. In Northern Ireland, the top flight game on average costs £12, which I think is a very reasonable price to ask an adult to pay to come to a game. Whereas, I mean, for instance, in Scotland, tickets can be in excess of £20, sometimes in excess of £30. And I think that is an awful lot of money to ask people to pay, especially if that's just the cost of an adult's ticket, where if you are, a mother, a father, an auntie, an uncle, and you want to take, say, one or two kids with you to the game, you're having to think about the cost of your own ticket, the cost of their ticket, and then obviously transport and food and all that comes with it. Some clubs, to their credit, I've got under 16s going in free. I took my niece and nephew to a game at Morton on Friday night, and it was £5 for under 16s, which again is a very reasonable price and really encouraging to take a younger member of your family along with you. But I certainly think the pricing as a whole is something we have to get better. 20s Plenty is a campaign that various fan groups have talked about in relation to away tickets, and I agree with that campaign. I would fully support it, but I think we have to even look at that across the board. And I think just look at implementing something that can work for the vast majority of people in the tough times that we're living in financially. I can understand that clubs could maybe say, maybe they could target 4 home games a season that they would say are category A games where the pricing is going to be more expensive. I'm thinking of the big derby matches or a 10s run-in or something, where maybe there is scope for them to make more money and feel the need to do that. But the rest of the games in the campaign are capped at a certain price that they are accessible, because having an abundance of season ticket holders for clubs like, say, Celtic or Rangers or Aberdeen, Hearts, Hibs is fantastic, because you've got a real core of fans there that are going to be there. And if they're not there, there's going to be fans on a waiting list ready to take their place. But further down the pyramid, the reality is pricing can make a massive difference to whether you sell 200 season tickets or 800 season tickets. And I think that's something that everyone needs to consider very carefully.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also going to give a shout out here to Gavin from Scotland's Coefficient. He did a great post a few months ago. Again, I'll put this in the show notes. But he did a bit of a deep dive into this kind of away allocations, but also away pricing. So in England, the rules on away fans are a lot stronger than we've got in Scotland. So the Premier League in England have capped tickets at 30 quid. but in Scotland, there's no price cap. And so, fans regularly pay more than 30 quid. And there's also, of course, in Scotland, no rule about minimum allocations, or where seats should be allocated, should be located as well, because you end up with like restricted views quite a bit in Scotland as well. In England, the away allocation is at least 3,000 tickets unless the stadium capacity is less than 30,000, at which point the allocation has to be at least 10%. Now, I know Celtic and Rangers have agreed to 5% pretty much, for minimum for next season, which is good. But I love the 10% thing. Like you watch the English Premier League, like at the time of recording, Aston Villa beat Arsenal at the weekend, and seeing such a huge slice of the stadium be the away support and them just going absolutely mental it's just epic. It just makes for a great spectacle. I would just love to see those kind of big allocations, back in Scotland. But it's a tricky situation. I do also get the reasons why clubs want to keep it tight on those allocations.
I think there should be, whether it's 5% or 10%, I think it should be offered to all away clubs, and I think it should be a rule. And there should potentially be a deadline of, say, maybe a week or so before, where if you've not sold those tickets, they can maybe then be returned to the home club, who can then sell them on. I'm thinking about, say, for instance, Celtic or Rangers offer 10% allocation to, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but Livingston, say, and obviously at Celtic Park, that would be 6,000. At Ibrox, that would be 5,000. If Livingston come back and say we're only bringing 2,000 away fans, then Celtic or Rangers should then get those tickets back with a week to spare, and once they've worked out how they're going to segregate it with the stewards or whatever they have to do, if it's policing involved, the remaining tickets they've got, they should then be allowed to sell on to fans to go in the home end at general sale. And just on that as well, and this is another point I think is important to make, because I know Aberdeen have made it in relation to the semi-final coming up against Celtic. I think for neutral venues, for cup games, whether it be a semi-final and a final, I think 50-50 should be offered from the outset. But again, there should be a deadline built in where if a club can't sell their 50%, that they would return the tickets and then they are allocated back to the other club, who can then try and sell them if that may be the case. I think we need to get to a point where, there is a fairness across the board, where fans don't feel frustrated. Like, for instance, Rangers Hearts, I think, it's been offered as a 50-50 split. Celtic Aberdeen hasn't. And that obviously leaves Aberdeen fans feeling, well, where's the fairness in this? Where's the written rule? And as you say, Kieran, because there isn't one, it's open to interpretation, which sometimes can be a good thing, but a lot of the time can't be, especially when we talk about the tribalism in Scottish football of all leagues.
Yeah, that whole thing is just a mess. And do you know what? It comes around every year. Every single year, this issue rises its head on like, oh, what's the split? And do you get 50-50? I mean, come on, guys, just sort it out. Make a rule and stick to it. Because honestly, it's just every year it's so predictable and just sums up like the chaotic management of Scottish football. I don't know. Just makes me despair. But again, just so predictable. Great. Okay, listen, Callum, I think we're coming to the end of this podcast, but I've thoroughly enjoyed it. But before I let you go, I'll ask you the question I ask every guest, which is, if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing about Scottish football, what would it be?
I would have one, but it kind of molds into two. I would like to see bigger leagues with greater financial means coming in via broadcasting, whether that be a bespoke platform like we see in the League of Ireland. I would like to see something like that come in, along with a principal broadcaster who, in this instance, Sky, would have their first pick, say, of at least one game per weekend. Then the league itself could maybe select one or two games that could go onto the platform for the Premiership and the Championship. And the reason I say bigger leagues is because I think if you had the top flight of 16 or even 18, if you want to push it that far, I think it would be more engaging for fans. Now, I know a lot of people will say the bigger derby matches in the league, whether that be in Glasgow or Edinburgh or Aberdeen, Dundee United, when they're both in the top flight, we want to see those 4 times a season. I can understand that argument, but if you've got a bigger league, there's just a freshness to it, a variety to it, where there's different teams competing. You could maybe open the relegation places up where you could have 2 automatic relegation places and 1 playoff place, or 3 down, 3 up, and really open the league up and open the pyramid up to the point where if you are relegated, of course, it's painful from a sporting perspective, but it's not the cliff edge financially that it could be. And it would maybe encourage, teams to implement, more progressive styles of play, in the sense that if there's 3 going down, then 3 are coming up. And that you can regroup and go again. Whereas at the moment, I think for a lot of teams, if they're relegated from the Premiership and there's only 1 automatic place for coming back up, and you've got a playoff that's then heavily weighted in favour of the Premiership club, I think it can breed a sense of safety first, pragmatism at all costs. And although it's easy to critique that from the outside looking in, as so often we all can be guilty of doing, you can kind of understand that from a manager and coach's point of view, where and even a club's point of view, where we just cannot afford to go down. So I think my magic wand would be, as I say, to create bigger leagues in Scotland to give us some extra variety and colour to the games that we watch every week, and hopefully a greater television deal, whether that be with the broadcaster putting more money in Sky, or create a centralised league platform that would allow us to make more money and hopefully create a really fluid system in Scottish football where we can have lots of excitement, tell the stories of so many of the wonderful clubs that we've got, not only within the top flight and the second tier, but all across Scottish football. You think of a club off the top of my head right now, Dumbarton, who won the first league titles in Scottish football. Why is that story not being told more often? They're a club that, yes, you could say what happened over 100 odd years ago and who's really going to be interested, but I think you would get people that were interested if you told that story well and compared it to how they were able to do that all those years ago and where they are now and what the challenges are. So I think there's a lot to do, but that's something that I would do if I could wave a magic wand.
Brilliant. Yep. Sounds good. I am fully on board your magic wand, if that's not a euphemism. Okay, right, brilliant. All right, thanks, Callum. Really appreciate you coming on. So big thank you to you for coming on, and a big thank you to everyone who was listening. This podcast was produced by Edinburgh Documentary Films, which is a film and media company co-founded by me, Kieran Hennigan. So we make documentaries for TV and cinema, but we also work with companies and brands to help them tell their stories in impactful and meaningful ways. You can find out more at edinburghdocs.co.uk, and please contact me directly if you'd like to talk about any potential projects.